Hey guys, welcome back. So as always, as I like to start, which is a huge thank you to all of you who have liked, shared and subscribed so far. Your support really does mean the world to me. I appreciate every single one of you coming back. So if you can just like, share this video, and I will keep on making this content for you. So today's case, I'm going to be talking about very similar circumstances to my Stephen Paul video. So if you haven't seen that yet, then you can go back a couple of months and watch that. So obviously a lot of us in the world, we do tend to use, I don't anymore, but we tend to have used apps like Grindr, Tinder, depending on how you identify. And obviously, you know, I spent a lot of time in the past on Grindr, meeting people on Grindr. And while there's nothing wrong with that per se, you know, it's become very, very popular. It's a lot easier to meet people through those apps. It does tend to have its dark moments, and you can end up, unfortunately, having your sliding doors moment with someone you don't really want to have that moment with. The man I'm going to be talking about today, his name is Mark Latunski. I'm hoping it's a case that you're not overly familiar with, or hopefully haven't heard of. I know you guys seem to be liking that. I know a couple of you have requested more videos talking about crimes against LGBT people, and while that is going to be a focus for me, it's not going to be my main focus, because I want to give a voice to every single victim that is out there, and if the story catches my eye, then I'm going to talk about it. So with all that said, let's go on with today's video. So Mark Latunski, so he was born in 1969 and lived all of his life in Michigan. And from the little that I could find about his childhood, because while I was doing my research, comparing to the graphic details that are in this case, it's not one that was really easy to find, if I'm honest. You know, if you actually search up Mark Latunski, you know, there are a few American YouTubers who are doing videos on him, but they are only making like 20-minute, half-hour videos on him, which is surprising because his police interview is available on YouTube. There's 911 calls about him available on YouTube. So I don't really understand why they're only making these really short videos. What I could ascertain about his childhood was that he grew up on a farm. So his parents were beef and pork farmers. It's just as much as I could find. I found out he was a student at Michigan University, and that started in 1987, and he was studying chemistry at university. In 1991 he actually switched over to Iowa State University, and he ends up earning a master's degree 4 years later in 1995. And his IQ at this time, it was tested, and he said that he actually possessed a genius level, and which is a common theme amongst many convicted murderers and whatnot. They tend to have really high IQs. I'm not saying everyone who has a high IQ is wrong one, but it tends to go with the serial killer territory, that they do have relatively high IQs. So he begins his career as a chemist not long after, and he actually kept this position up until the point of his arrest, or the year of his arrest. It doesn't really give an actual specified date of when he actually retired from being a chemist. In 1995, he reportedly tried to sue the city of Armes. He believed that the $1 monthly charge for the storm sewers was unconstitutional, but he eventually ended up losing this case. In 2001, he ends up meeting his longtime wife, Emily. So they end up marrying later on that year, and they went on to have 4 children together. They had a little boy first and went on to have 3 daughters. The couple then bought a house on Tyrell Road in Michigan, and they basically lived there up until the point of Mark's arrest. And it was during the marriage that Mark reportedly showed various worrying signs about his mental health state, and this will come to light in the 2013 divorce proceedings between him and Emily, so we're going to get onto that in a little while. So he was diagnosed in 2010 and 2012 with severe recurring and chronic depression with psychiatric episodes, adjustment disorder, paranoid schizophrenia, and borderline personality traits. And while he was placed on medication for these conditions, Mark actually had a long history with not or refusing to take his medication. And I can kind of understand a little bit, you know, obviously schizophrenia comes with the territory of being paranoid. So, very briefly, on a side note, so my brother I've spoken a little bit in the past about his problems. I'm not going to go into full detail because that's his business, but when we were younger, so he was in his mid-teens, he was placed on a certain medication that the doctors believed would help him. And somewhere along the line, he overheard through the grapevine that this particular medication would actually stunt the growth of his penis. So he actually believed this over what the medical professionals were telling him, and he refused to take this medication, even though all the science behind it was backing up the fact that it was just literally impossible. But he just got it in his head. And I think if you are in that fragile sort of mindset and obviously paranoia, you hear something, it's going to convince you the negative way rather than the positives of taking this medication. So there's a little bit of sympathy there that I've got for Mark. What he goes on to do, I don't sympathise with him at all, but just a little bit understanding about his mental health condition at this point. So she said that Mark would end up staying up really late watching horror films, and while he was watching these films he would talk to himself. He would leave the house for the rest of the night. He would then threaten his children to get rid or kill their animals. Mark would accuse Emily of having multiple affairs. He would go on to say that his son wasn't actually his son, he was a product of one of these affairs. He would go on long periods of neglecting his appearance and hygiene, which, again, is a really common thing when you have severe depression. One of the things that falls by the wayside is your personal appearance. You physically just can't get yourself into that mindset of taking care of yourself, or even sometimes you don't even leave your bed, and this can go on for like months at a time. So it is, again, just a little bit of understanding, a little bit of sympathy, but not fully. He actually became convinced that someone actually poisoned the water supply to his house, and he would regularly call someone out to have his water tested. All of this was coming back fine. Like, you know, there was no signs of any tampering, there was no signs of any poison, but he was just really, really convinced that someone was out to get him. So this led to Emily ending their marriage, and they divorced in 2013. So all of what I've spoke about was in the divorce proceedings. So at some point, Mark begins working as an escort. He's working in the local areas, and most of his clients at this point are men. And this then introduces him to the BDSM culture. And a lot of people are interested into BDSM. They are into BDSM, whether it be a very small amount or they will go down the real graphic route. But as long as it's between two consenting adults, who really cares? But Emily was given the custody of the 4 children. And in 2012, she grew really concerned when one day Mark actually took the children out for a day trip to a water park, and he failed to bring the children back on the time that they had both agreed, and she grew really concerned and actually called the police. So Mark was eventually found and he was arrested for custodial kidnapping, and the case was then taken to court. And rather than any sort of long-term punishment for Mark, the agreement was that he would only complete his probation if he stuck to taking his medication. And he actually sticks to this. He starts taking his medication on a regular basis, and this obviously ends up with him passing the probation. But this was all short-lived, and he soon just really goes back to refusing the medication. Neighbours started growing concerned about him at this point, and he had the cops called on him numerous times about his welfare. One particular day, the police turning up, and they actually found Mark laying in his driveway pretending he was dead. And I think at this point they were kind of on first name terms with Mark, and they would just they went up to him and they were like, "Mark, we know you're alive. Like, what is going on?" And they just basically took him aside, made him a cup of tea, and on their way. In 2015, Mark then meets a new partner, and this is a man called Jamie Arnold, who works as a hairdresser. And Mark and Jamie actually eventually end up marrying, and as a married couple, the two guys, they begin looking further and further into the world of BDSM. And it's kind of annoyed me reading this a little bit. I'm going to put it in here, but I really don't agree with it. But the investigators investigating the case, they basically describe Jamie and Mark's marriage as a seedy open marriage, which I don't agree, because, okay, yeah, they possibly did have an open marriage, inviting other couples or other single people into their worlds, but that's all between consenting adults. So what right are we got to judge on what people do during their marriage or their relationship? Like, it's none of our business, not the police's business. They had no right to comment on that as far as I'm concerned. But I can kind of see it from their point of view, because obviously we all know America is highly religious. A lot of people are religious in America, so they tend to frown upon anything that's not considered constitutional, and especially seeing as this was a gay marriage. So during the marriage to Jamie, Mark's mental health deteriorated even further. He ends up losing contact with his children, and eventually he loses his job as a chemist. So in February 2019, a co-worker said that Mark's mental health began impacting his job around 2012, and Mark was adamant that the management were out to get him. They were trying to poison him, And this simply wasn't true. Like, the managers, they did everything they could to try and support Mark, but he just become a bit too much of a reliability and a risk, and they were basically just really worried about him. So they felt like they had no other choice but to dismiss him. In September 2019, Jamie actually ended his really quick, brief marriage to Mark. He went on to say, "I knew something wasn't right, but I didn't know if it was that extreme. He was progressively getting worse and saying that the neighbours were poisoning him. It was just all nonsense. All I knew is that I had to get out of that situation." So he goes on to say very briefly what Emily was talking about in her divorce proceedings against Mark. Now, with his second marriage ended, Mark began using the Grindr app to talk to and meet potentially new partners. And he actually makes contact with a man called James Carlson, who lived in New York. So they initially began talking about BDSM role plays, and this eventually moves on to discussions about cannibalism. So there are messages dated back to really early 2019. One message from Mark saying, "I would need to make sure my technique was perfect, pain-free and bloodless before I do you. I know that if the pig is afraid, the meat is tough, and the blood must be let to have meat that is tender." Now, James said with that he just felt that Mark was living in a fantasy world. To him, this was just part of the fantasy roleplay, but this was further from the truth. Mark really wasn't at this point living in any sort of fantasy world, and he, while talking to James, he begins constructing a kill room, so to speak. So he, in his basement, he starts building this kill room, and it contains tamper-resistant lights with cages around them, a 4-inch thick insulated door, and then a second sliding door in front of that. There was a trap door in the middle of this room, and the room was described to be about 12 feet long. Under the trap door was leading to the foundations under the house. There was various ropes, chains and weapons, various toys of certain degrees. And James, at a later date, when he finds out about this room, he's convinced that Mark did intend to kill him. We're going to get back onto that in a little while. But I don't know. If I was in James's situation and someone messaged me about cannibalism and referring to me as a pig, me and that block button would be best mates. And it just baffles me that you would go along with that kind of conversation. Like, I know we all live in a fantasy world, we all have an ideal sort of fantasy sort of scenario, but I highly doubt cannibalism is on the top of many people's ideal fantasies. So on October the 9th, 2019, James ends up making the 20-hour bus journey to Mark's house. So like I said, he lives in New York. And another thing as well, if I looked into this and saw that it was going to take me 20 hours, like practically a whole day to get there, just for a bit of, you know, bondage and roleplay, I was like, no, I can probably pick that up pretty easy, really locally. I'm not going to travel that far for a little bit of slap and tickle. But Mark actually ends up paying for this trip, and he also ends up paying for the return ticket home, even though he had no intention of letting James go, he had to show in some sort of way that he did have that intention. So, on the 10th of October, 911, they receive a phone call from James, and he tells them that he's been tied up in a man's basement and that he has actually managed to escape. He had been tied up with chains that had a leather rope connected to his ankles. To the left of him was a really large knife that he's picked up and managed to use to cut through the leather, and he's escaped out of the house. He's in a terrified situation. The police are asking him, obviously, if he's still got the knife. He says yes, because if Mark comes after him, he doesn't know what he's going to do. He assures the police that as soon as he sees it's them coming up in their car, he's going to chuck the knife away. He doesn't want to hurt the police. He just wants protection from this man. And the dispatcher says, relays all this information back to the police. You can actually listen to this. If you look up Mark Latunski, you can listen to the 911 calls. So he does exactly as he says. He tells the police that, well, it all started as consensual. He didn't know if he had been spiked or not. He just basically randomly woke up to see that he had been chained up. He tells them he wasn't actually able to go home as his return ticket wasn't good for another couple of days. And the police reports say that James was just really, really uncooperative. He goes on to reevaluate the situation in their words. He reevaluates it, and he felt that it was a sexual role play and not a false imprisonment, and he actually ended up going back to Mark's house to stay until he could get home. If that was me in that situation, I felt like that, you know, I might look at it differently later down the line. But you've woken up to be tied up, you're panicked. That's usually a good response to tell you not to go back to that fucking house. And if it was me, I would probably camp out in the bus station up until a point that I can get back home. So on November the 26th, 2019, police then receive another 911 call from another really terrified young male. And this man has never been identified. He's referred to as John Doe in a lot of the case findings. So he begins hysterically telling his version of events to the dispatcher, and he's trying to find somewhere safe for him to hide. And he actually runs up to a neighbour's house around 4 PM, and the only thing that he's actually wearing is a leather kilt. And he's banging on the door. The neighbour answers the door. The neighbour actually spoke out about this, and he said that this man was just in a complete blind panic and was begging for protection from someone. And as he said, it was around 4 PM. All he was doing was just sitting in his house watching TV, and he could hear the police on the other end of the phone. And he said that eventually a silver Subaru just comes up out of nowhere, and another man with a beard steps out wearing the exact same leather kilt, and the younger man sees him and starts screaming and hiding behind the neighbour, and he's like, please, please keep him away from me, in absolute blind rage. So obviously that man was Mark that stepped out of the car, and Mark just says that he wants his leather kilt back. He didn't mean any harm, and he's just basically saying that it's stolen property. This then doesn't get investigated any further. Mark gets his property back, leaves, and I don't know what happened with this younger boy. There's no follow-up reports, nothing about his safety or where he come from. It just refers to him as John Doe. I'm assuming he's gone underground, probably really terrified and scarred from this experience. So in December 2019, Mark then makes contact with a 25-year-old hairdresser called Kevin Bacon. We're going to get onto that name choice in a little while. His father speaks about that, but obviously, just for clearance, I'm not going to be talking about the actor. It was just down to pure coincidence that they ended up having the same name. So, after a few days of messaging, they actually agreed to meet on Christmas Eve that year. And this seemed like an ideal situation for Kevin, because whilst Christmas Eve is usually a time that we will spend with our family, we'll have like a massive meal or a takeaway if, you know, certain parts of the UK it seems to be a tradition to have a takeaway on Christmas Eve. So this was just a perfect opportunity for Kevin not to do that. So reportedly there was someone that was due at his family home that was coming over to visit that he wasn't on good terms with, he wanted to avoid. So having this meeting with Mark seemed like the perfect chance to get out of this. So I'm just going to stop the story there for a moment. We're going to take a look at who Kevin was. So Kevin was born November 28th, 1994, and this was to his parents Carl Bacon and Pamela Van Horn. And he had one younger sibling, a sister called Jennifer, who was born in 1995. The Carl reflected on his son's name and said that he didn't name Kevin after the actor. It just kind of happened to be a coincidence. He wanted Kevin to have the same initials as him, so KB, and he settled on Kevin. He goes on to say that obviously the actor wasn't as big of a name as he is these days, that he was only really widely known at that point for Footloose. He said that he just didn't want to go down the route of naming him Carl Jr., so he chose the name Kevin. So Kevin graduated from high school in 2013 and he pursued a career in hair and beauty. He was described to have quite an individual style. He always had bright, colourful hair, which something I did when I was Kevin's age. He said that his body was like a mosaic of really colourful tattoos. Again, same, I've got quite a large collection of colourful tattoos. He began working at a salon called Uniquely You, and this was actually only a week before he ends up meeting Mark. He had plans to actually go to uni to study psychology, and he was described as a really smart, funny, empathetic, and really open about his own mental health issues. Friends said that Kevin really struggled with self-esteem issues, and this led to him self-harming, led to him having eating disorders, really dangerous sexual behaviour, and sadly on one occasion Kevin did attempt to take his own life. Kevin was said to have a really close relationship with his friend Michelle Myers, and the two actually ended up living together. She said that Kevin had been meeting men on Tinder and Grindr quite regularly for the past 4 years at this point. So obviously back to Kevin and Mark meeting. So they meet on Grindr. Mark is using the name Olikos, and this means wolf in Greek. And this conversation was obtained by the investigators, and apparently this was quite a challenge for him because Grindr really wasn't helpful in them solving this case. So they could see that Kevin was actually having conversations with Mark about being used by multiple men, and what he described as a complete loss of control. Mark says that he can actually make this happen and details a situation where Kevin will be naked, blindfolded, and delivered to other men to be used and abused. And Kevin says he would actually need to be helpless to be fully terrified. Christmas Eve then obviously comes around, and Kevin, he goes to do his day work at the salon, and he then drops his mum home and returns to his own house and begins talking to Mark again. So they agree to meet at a shopping centre in Clayton Township, and that's later on in the evening on Christmas Eve night. And Mark tells Kevin that he will meet 5 men for sex, and once the scene is over, he will be returned safely. So Kevin asks for reassurance on his safety, and Mark replies, "I'm going to transport you and let you determine if I am trustworthy." So Kevin then said that he was going to go have a shower, prep himself, go get ready. And Mark and Kevin end up meeting around 6 PM that evening. And what we're going to discuss now, this is all from Mark's mouth. So he gives a full and frank confession to the police during his interview. And again, it's something that you can actually watch. So he said that he gave Kevin a bag of fetish wear, and Kevin tried on a Y harness, but it didn't actually fit him. So Kevin was said to have been quite a larger boy, with quite a large body frame. So I'm someone who has actually tried on this gear, and yeah, sometimes it doesn't always fit if you are a larger framed person. So Kevin ends up just getting naked, and he puts on earmuffs, blinders, wrist and ankle restraints, and this is all part to live the illusion of his fantasy. So Mark then gives Kevin 2 towels to wrap himself up in. He takes Kevin's clothes and belongings and locks them in Kevin's car. Kevin then asks if he's actually allowed to send a message to Michelle, just to obviously tell her that he is safe. And Michelle said that she received a message at 6:12 PM, and it read, "I'm going to be out for a while. He's inviting more men. Merry Dickmas. Not sure when I'll be back. Probably be out late. If Mum calls you, I'm sleeping." So Mark then takes Kevin back to his house, and while no other men were actually present at this time, they role-played as if there was. So apparently this roleplay situation here begins in the kitchen, and Mark holds a fantasy auction where Kevin will be sold as a sex slave, and they end up going into the basement. So Mark says that he doesn't recall how long they actually had sex for, but when they did finish, Kevin asked for Mark to kill him. So I'm not saying that's true, because what actually happens to Kevin, I can't actually see anyone wanting to go through this. I think this is just obviously Mark's way of trying to get off a little bit more lightly with the whole situation. So apparently Kevin asked Mark to kill him, and Mark says, "We made an agreement that he was supposed to disappear and be gone." So Mark then picks up a hunting knife with a 4-inch blade, and he stabs Kevin in the back of the neck. So this initially doesn't kill Kevin, and Mark ends up slitting his throat. He then ties Kevin's ankles together, and using a system of weights and pulleys, he suspends Kevin from the ceiling in the kill room. He said that part of the agreement was that Kevin said that Mark could use his body to be turned into something that would give life. Mark then ties Kevin's ankles, like I said, suspends it from the ceiling, and he weighs the ropes down, and he then cuts into Kevin's scrotum and removes his testicles. He takes these back to the kitchen and actually cooks and eats them from an iron skillet. And he then sends a text to James Coulson at 2:15 on Christmas morning saying, "I killed Kevin Bacon. Kevin Bacon is my heroes." He then sent a photo of Kevin's testicles actually cooking, sorry. And James said that he didn't really give any thought to this image. He just assumed it was something that he technically was preparing it, but he just didn't think it was someone being cannibalized. So James just ends up texting Mark back and saying, "I hope you enjoy," and he then switches the subject over to more pictures of the kill room. But he refers to it as his room. So, in Mark's head, part of this agreement that Kevin made with him was that Mark would be allowed to actually use his bone marrow as plant food. The blood would drip down into the foundations, also to feed the flowers, and he apparently gave permission for Mark to use his muscles and turn it into jerky. We're going to talk a little bit more about that later on. That does crop up a little bit later on during the interview. So Kevin's parents, they begin to worry when he fails to show up for the breakfast, Christmas morning breakfast at 9 AM as agreed. And they knew something that was wrong, as this was really out of character for Kevin. So they start searching for him, and they find his car that later on, still at the shopping centre. All his belongings still in the bag inside the car. And they immediately report him missing. So the next couple of days they organise searches with Michelle, and they distribute flyers all over the town. So police, they look into Kevin's online activity, and initially Grindr, like I said earlier, Grindr basically just said that they can't help, there's nothing they can do about it. And Michelle is actually able to hack into Kevin's account, and another man actually reaches out to Michelle on a different platform. So he's found one of the flyers, he's heard about Kevin, and so he reaches out to Michelle, and he informs her of Mark and tells her the incidents of James and the unnamed man, and he sends over a photo of Mark, and police, they just instantly, they recognise who this man is. So they go to Mark's house on December the 27th, 2019, and Mark is found to be really cooperative. So Officer Richard Lee then notices the sliding door to the basement, and he quickly gets the warrant to search further, and they go down into the basement, and they sadly find Kevin still suspended by his ankles. So Mark is immediately arrested, and during questioning, he sticks to the story about the murder being consensual. He begins detailing it as discussed, and he starts making really bizarre claims about his own life. He tells the police that Kevin consented to Mark using his muscles as jerky, as we already discussed, So it's a really long process that you have to go through to cure meat, to turn it into jerky. He was planned to, obviously, once taking the muscles out, to remove the bones, smash the bones up to a fine powder to feed to his plants. He tells the police that Mark Latunski isn't actually his real name. Apparently, Mark Latunski was an identity that his mother stole from a disabled child, who was born between 1969 and 1972. His true identity was actually hidden in a trust fund that his mother was meant to give to him, but the day that she reportedly was meant to give this trust fund over to him, she died, and he doesn't actually know where this trust fund is. He says that all he knows about his real identity is that he's of royal descent and that he's Norwegian. And he has the title of a Thomas of Wales, and that he's the last person alive to actually hold this title. He talks about various companies that record every part of his private life. Eventually, the interview ends up going back onto the topic of Kevin, and Mark basically just sticks to his story. Police, they just basically tell him, even if this is the case, even if Kevin did agree for you to do all this, we wouldn't be taking that into account. You will still be charged with murder, as the consent that you claim, it will actually be seen as invalid. So Mark has really long discussions about consent, and he says that he joked to Kevin on that night, if the cops find you tied up and ask if you consented, you need to say yes, otherwise you better pray that I never get out of prison. I mean, he says it's like a really funny joke. He laughs as he's talking about this. To me, it sounded a bit like a nervous laugh, because he knows he's fucked. But in his head, he's telling all this because he thinks he's going to get off a little bit more leniently. I believe, anyway. From what I can see, it just speaks in that sort of volume. So Mark then says that he runs a Facebook page under the name of Olycus, and members, they talk about similar things that they want done to them. Mark is actually referred to as Alpha. He goes on to say that he prepared Kevin's testicles the way he would prepare and cook Rocky Mountain oysters. He then is placed on remand to await his trial in court, and during the preparation for the trial, Mark was found unresponsive numerous times, in fact twice, in February 2020, and the ruling at the time meant that he wasn't actually mentally fit to stand trial. This was eventually overturned by October of 2020. In February 2022, so obviously bearing in mind, thinking about the time of 2020 to 2022, the whole world was in and out of lockdowns. We obviously had the coronavirus, so that put a delay on multiple things, including trials. So in 2022, Mark's attorneys then requested that Mark's statements and photos taken at the scene should not be admitted into court, as well as the information about his previous encounters. So obviously talking about his encounter with James and the one that they refer to as John Doe. But Judge Matthew Stewart ruled that the evidence will be used. It's really vital that this is actually put out into the ethos. So in March, the trial again was delayed when Mark's attorneys, they asked for another evaluation of Mark's mental state, and Matthew Stewart, he just basically says Mark is completely competent to stand trial. This was by May in 2022, and just before the trial started to begin, in September of that year, Mark actually pleads guilty to murder. And this was against the advice of his attorneys, so they wanted to go down the mental health route, and that he wasn't fully aware at a particular moment in time of what he was doing. But Mark, I don't know his reasoning behind this. He's never spoke out about it, but he probably just wanted the whole thing over with, and he probably thought going guilty would give him possibly a little more lenient sentence. That does work in the UK. I don't know if it works in the US, so to speak. I'm not really sure if Michigan is a town that actually has the death penalty or not. So whether if he goes guilty, he gets to live, I'm not 100% if I'm honest. So obviously, like I said, he pleads guilty against his attorney's wishes, and in December 2022 he's sentenced to life without parole, and he is actually currently held at Gus Harrison Correctional Facility. So Mark's house was auctioned off not long, sadly, after Kevin's murder, and a man called Alex Dill actually bought the house for $100,000, and he spoke out about things that he found in the house, and the auction was actually televised and people were interviewed. I've seen this clip myself, and one particular person, she really sounds really giddy about the possibility of living in this house. So Alex said that when he went in, bear in mind this was only 2 months after Kevin's murder, Alex said that he goes in and he basically has to clean up human remains. He said that in the kitchen there was a brand new dishwasher, still had this plastic on it. He's opened the dishwasher and there was a few plates inside, and all of these plates still had human remains on them. And he just basically says that, you know, I bought a house in good faith because houses don't kill people. And whilst, yeah, that's true to some aspect, I don't understand. I really don't understand. I know we're all interested in true crime, but would you truly buy a house that became that infamous and sit there and openly talk about it? And he doesn't sound that much of a guy. Like, he just doesn't sound convincing when he's talking about it. He, like the woman that I mentioned a minute ago, sounds almost excited. It's just really wrong. The house was actually later on that particular year bought back by Mark's family, so Alex just basically had to abandon ship and move out. Kevin's funeral was actually held in on January the 3rd, 2020, and floral tributes were held at both his old school and at his place of work. The actor, Kevin Bacon, he actually spoke out once he heard about this case, and he put a tribute on his Instagram page, and the tribute is actually still on there. I had a little scroll through and I did find it, and it says, "For obvious reasons, I'm thinking this morning about the friends and family of a young person, Kevin Bacon. His life has been taken away way too soon. His love of hairdressing, his love was hairdressing, sorry. And then he just signed off with like his own little joke about himself. Just says, I bet he would have loved to have done a great job on the messes on my head. R.I.P. KB. Kevin was actually said to have been a massive fan of Jeffree Star. For those of you who don't know who Jeffree Star is, he's quite a famous makeup artist. He formerly was a singer. He runs his own YouTube where he does makeup tutorials. He owns his own makeup company, so he's pretty well known. It's very much, I would say, kind of like P-Birds, just without plastic surgery. That's kind of what he reminds me of, but really, really super talented guy, you know, in my opinion anyway. So Jeffree actually dedicated to a video to Kevin, and also to another fan who sadly passed away at the same time. So this video was posted onto Jeffree's YouTube, and Jeffree also donated over $20,000 towards the costs of Kevin's funeral. So after the events of what actually happened, sadly Kevin's parents divorced, and Pamela, she spoke out and said, because of Latunski, we got a divorce. We just couldn't move past it. Carl spoke out about his favourite memory of Kevin, and he said, my only thought just always goes back to when he was first born. It's the only thing I could think of, holding him in my hands. I was the second person to hold him after his mother. Holding him is all I could think of, and now that's no longer. And then his younger sister Jennifer, she put out her own personal statement about her brother. She called Kevin her guardian angel, and she said that Kevin, she will always miss him because Kevin was her only sibling, and that we shared a deep love for one another. The things I miss most about Kevin are his beautiful smile and his generous heart. He truly was my best friend. So I guess the only thing we can really take away from this is just be really, really dubious about who we are actually talking to online. I know Tinder have got around to doing the blue tick check on like verified accounts. Sorry, couldn't think of the words. So they're doing verified account checks on as safety features. I know quite a lot of dating apps are doing very, very similar. I highly hope that Grindr start following suit with their security checks, because obviously it's the first time this has happened through that site, and it's one of the main reasons that I no longer use the site. I really hope that you guys in some way have enjoyed today's story. I hope that if you have heard of this story that I've given you a little bit of something new, a little bit more insight on it. I would love to know your thoughts and feelings, so please leave a comment down below, and I will see you guys next week for the next true crime story. Stay safe, and I'll see you